I'm Emily, a 29-year-old vet who invested years of savings into a beautiful family lake house, jointly owned with my parents. When my younger sister, Chloe, was diagnosed with a rare illness needing costly treatments, I urged my parents to sell the property. They refused, saying, "The lake house isn't going anywhere." Later, reviewing old deeds, I stumbled upon an obscure clause, a hidden environmental easement that complicated any remortgage for my brother David's struggling startup. They dismissed my findings, believing it insignificant, until David's bank mysteriously halted their loan. If you've ever felt like your family's priorities were strangely misaligned, or like you were fighting a silent battle for what was right, hit that like button and subscribe. Join me as I recount the full story and discover that standing up for what's truly important sometimes means unearthing truths that redefine everything you thought you knew about family. The first whispers of summer always brought with them the faint, nostalgic scent of pine and lake water, the essence of our family's Lakeview property in northern Wisconsin. It was a sprawling, somewhat rustic lake house, a place of cherished memories and, I believed, shared dreams. We'd purchased it jointly when I was 20, still in my second year of veterinary school. The agreement had been clear. I would contribute a significant chunk of my earnings from years of meticulous saving, piecing together scholarships and part-time clinic work, and in return, the property would be a collective family asset. A tranquil retreat, a sanctuary from the relentless pace of city life, and crucially, a sound investment for our collective future. My parents, Arthur and Alina, always echoed this sentiment, their voices imbued with the wisdom of financial prudence, a lesson I had absorbed deeply and taken to heart. It wasn't just a financial commitment for me, it was an emotional tether, a tangible symbol of our family's unity, a place where laughter echoed and worries dissolved with the setting sun. But even then, in those idyllic summers, subtle fissures in our family's facade of equality began to surface. My older brother, David, was and always had been the golden boy. Charming, ambitious, but disastrously impulsive when it came to money, he operated under a completely different set of rules. While I meticulously tracked every dollar, every investment, every contribution to our shared lake house, David pursued a relentless parade of grand, often ill-conceived business ventures. Each one, without fail, seemed to culminate in a parental bailout. He'd flunked out of 2 different business programs, leaving behind a trail of debt that my parents, without hesitation, absorbed. "David just needs a bit more time to find his footing, darling," my mother would coo, while my father would sigh dramatically about the unfairness of the business world, never once hinting that David should contribute to the Lake House Fund or any other family saving for that matter. They'd often lament his struggles to me, framing his financial mishaps as unfortunate but inevitable hurdles on his path to greatness. A part of me, the part that craved their approval, swelled with a quiet pride at their implied trust in my responsibility, my reliability. But a smaller, quieter voice, a nascent awareness, began to whisper about the stark imbalance. My contributions to the lake house, substantial as they were, felt less like a shared investment in a collective future and more like a necessary supplement to David's endless, costly pursuits. This underlying dynamic, a subtle but persistent favoritism, was a pattern I was growing accustomed to, though it settled in my stomach with a vague, uncomfortable unease. It was the unspoken truth in our seemingly harmonious family, a quiet tension that simmered beneath the surface of our sun-drenched Lakeview summers. I continued to build my career, graduating with honors from veterinary school and quickly establishing myself in a bustling small animal practice in Chicago. Life was good. I loved my work, found immense joy in the daily symphony of purrs and barks, and felt a quiet satisfaction in my growing financial independence. I maintained a cordial, if somewhat distant, relationship with David, his chaotic life often a source of bewildering amusement rather than genuine concern. The Lakeview property remained a constant, a comforting symbol of stability and a safe haven. It was a solid financial pillar, one I rarely worried about, feeling secure in its shared ownership. I contributed monthly to its upkeep, paid my precise share of the property taxes, and even spent my precious weekends painting the weathered deck and tackling minor repairs, my hands calloused but content. It was our lake house, a tangible manifestation of our shared future, a promise of enduring familial bonds. This sense of security, this quiet confidence in our collective well-being, was about to be shattered in the most unimaginable way, pulling back the curtain on a decade of subtle yet profound favoritism that had quietly festered beneath the surface. The foundation of trust I had meticulously built my life upon was about to be put to the ultimate test, the true nature of family love revealed in the crucible of crisis. The first phone call from my mother about Chloe was deceptively calm, almost dismissive, a brief interlude in an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. "Chloe's been feeling a bit under the weather, Emily. Nothing serious, just a little tired." But I knew Chloe. My younger sister, a vibrant, artistic soul with an infectious laugh and an insatiable curiosity, was rarely under the weather. She was a whirlwind of energy, always sketching, always exploring. A few weeks later, the calls from my mother became more urgent, tinged with a brittle anxiety that even her practiced calm couldn't mask. Chloe was pale, her usual spark dimmed, constantly fatigued and experiencing strange, debilitating muscle spasms that left her crumpled in pain. Doctors at first were baffled, attributing her symptoms to stress or common viral infections. Then came the devastating diagnosis, a rare, aggressive autoimmune disease. The words, a mouthful of complex scientific terms, sounded like a death sentence whispered in hushed, sterile tones. My heart sank, a leaden weight settling in my chest. The treatment, a cutting-edge experimental therapy, offered a fragile thread of hope, but it came with a staggering price tag, tens of thousands of dollars monthly, a sum largely uncovered by our insurance. It was a financial tsunami, threatening to engulf not just Chloe, but our entire family. My busy veterinary practice, though successful, didn't leave me with vast personal reserves, especially after finally paying off the last of my student loans. My mind immediately raced to the Lakeview property. It was jointly owned, a substantial asset, its value easily enough to cover a year or more of Chloe's desperately needed treatments. This was exactly what an emergency fund, a family asset, was for. This was the catastrophic, unforeseen crisis we had supposedly prepared for. I drove home that weekend, the miles blurring past, armed with meticulously organized medical reports, grim prognoses, and a detailed spreadsheet outlining the crippling costs. I was convinced that this shared investment, this symbol of our collective prosperity, would finally serve its ultimate, life-saving purpose. I found my parents in their sunlit living room, the late afternoon sun casting long, deceptive shadows through the window, making everything seem serene. "Mom, Dad," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, a tremor born of fear for Chloe. "Chloe needs this. The doctors say it's her best shot, her only real chance. We have the lake house. We can sell it, or at least take out a significant loan against it. Its value is more than enough to cover the treatments for a long time." A strange, almost imperceptible shift occurred in the room, a subtle cooling of the air. My father, Arthur, cleared his throat, a telltale sign of his discomfort, avoiding my desperate gaze. "Emily," he started, his voice firm, edged with a tone of finality, "we've discussed this. The lake house is our retirement, our safety net. It's not just a casual fund for medical fads." My mother, Eleanor, chimed in, her voice softer but equally resolute, a velvet glove over an iron fist. "Darling, Chloe has insurance, and there are charities. We can't just liquidate our future for one expense." My blood ran cold. "One expense? Mom, Dad, this is Chloe's life. The insurance only covers a fraction. This isn't a fad, it's a potentially life-saving treatment." I pressed on, detailing the excruciating severity of Chloe's condition, the doctor's urgent pleas, the grim prognosis without immediate intervention. I reminded them of our shared investment, my decade of unwavering contributions, the very purpose of a family asset. I emphasized the collective sacrifices we had supposedly made for this very kind of moment. But their resolve was an impenetrable wall, cold and unyielding. "We've thought about this extensively, Emily," my father insisted, his voice rising slightly, the authoritative tone he used when he expected no further argument. "And we've decided the property is not to be touched for this. It's for pleasure, not charity. It's for our golden years." My mother nodded in agreement, a look of almost pained resignation on her face, as if my request was an unreasonable, almost selfish burden. I looked from one parent to the other, seeing not empathy, not even regret, but a cold, calculated refusal. Their expressions were set, their decision hardened. So David's endless business ventures, his constant need for bailouts, those were valid uses for family resources. I stated, my voice strained with disbelief and a rising anger. But Chloe's life-saving treatment isn't. My father bristled, his face tightening. That's different, Emily. David's investments are for the family's broader financial growth. This is a personal medical issue. The hypocrisy was a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth, burning in my throat. I left that meeting with a heavy heart, the brutal reality of their priorities hitting me like a physical blow. The lake house, my shared dream, my tangible contribution to our family's security, was apparently reserved for purposes that aligned with their narrow vision of family prosperity. A vision that clearly and devastatingly excluded Chloe's critical medical needs, and by extension, my own desperate pleas for her. I spent the rest of the weekend in a haze of frustration and mounting anger, trying in vain to make sense of their callous indifference. Chloe was getting sicker by the day, and her path to recovery seemed to be blocked by the very people who should have been her strongest, most loving allies. The sun, which once seemed to dance on the lake, now felt oppressive and mocking, mirroring the growing darkness settling in my heart. The house, once a beacon of family unity, now loomed as a cruel monument to their indifference, a silent testament to their misplaced loyalties. Over the next few days, Chloe's condition visibly worsened. Her once bright, inquisitive eyes now held a dull, profound fatigue, and her movements were slow, deliberate, each step seemingly requiring immense, painful effort. The experimental treatment was no longer just an option. It was becoming an agonizing necessity, a race against the clock. Yet my parents remained silent, offering only hollow platitudes about hope and prayer, but no practical, tangible assistance. The silence from them was louder, more damning than any heated argument, a deafening confirmation of their cold refusal. I spent my evenings consumed by a desperate search, researching every possible avenue for financial aid, every obscure charity, every high-interest loan program, but the numbers were daunting, a towering insurmountable wall, and time was a luxury Chloe simply didn't have. The frustration began to morph into a simmering rage, a molten core in my chest. How could they, with an asset as valuable and liquid as the Lakeview property, turn their backs on their own daughter, their own flesh and blood, when her very life hung in the balance? The question echoed endlessly in my mind, a tormenting, unanswerable refrain. Then came the unexpected phone call from David. His voice, usually brimming with an over-the-top, almost theatrical enthusiasm for his latest game-changing idea, sounded strained, almost furtive. "Hey, Em," he began, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. "Just wanted to catch up. How's Chloe doing, really?" His concern felt performative, a thinly veiled attempt to gauge my mood, to sniff out any potential trouble that might affect him. I gave him a brief, somber update, detailing Chloe's decline, then, unable to resist, pressed him directly. "Did Mom and Dad mention anything about the lake house? About helping Chloe?" There was a beat of uncomfortable silence on his end, then a nervous, almost imperceptible cough. Not really, Em. Look, I heard they're looking into some options for their future. You know, retirement planning." "Smart, right?" His evasiveness was a glaring red flag, a beacon flashing in the darkness. David rarely lied well, his discomfort was as transparent as glass. The conversation quickly, predictably, shifted to his own exciting new venture, a tech startup that sounded suspiciously vague and overly ambitious, even for him. He mentioned needing significant capital injections and was working on collateral for a major bank loan. A cold dread, a terrifying premonition, began to creep up my spine. Later that week, by pure chance, I was at my parents' house to pick up some old photo albums Chloe had wanted to look at. As I walked past my father's home office, a room usually hushed and private, I heard muffled, agitated voices. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized David's voice, hushed but insistent, tinged with an unusual anxiety. "Dad, the bank needs to see the appraisal for the Lakeview property by Friday. We can't let this opportunity for the startup slip through our fingers. It's too big." My mother's voice, equally hushed, responded, her tone laced with a nervous doubt. "Arthur, are you absolutely sure about this? It's a lot of money to tie up in David's new idea. What if it doesn't work out like the others?" My father's voice, however, was resolute, brimming with a familiar, unwavering conviction. "Alina, this is David's big chance. It's a sound investment for the family's future, a legacy. We're using the house as collateral for a significant remortgage. It's what's best for us, for David, for the family name." The words hit me like a physical blow, a sudden, brutal punch to the gut. Remortgage the lake house, for David's startup. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat of pure, unadulterated betrayal. This wasn't just a refusal to help Chloe. It was a deliberate, calculated choice to funnel vast resources that could save my sister's life, into David's latest, most audacious pipe dream, while my sister withered away, a victim of their cold, selective affection. I crept closer, pressing myself against the wall, straining to hear every damning word. David was talking about a bridge loan from a major bank and how they were almost on board if they could just get the property details finalized. My father was mentioning specific figures, numbers that far exceeded Chloe's immediate medical needs, numbers that felt like a deliberate, cruel slap in the face. They were talking about mortgaging our shared asset, the one I had poured a decade of my hard-earned savings into, the one they had deemed sacred, and for their retirement, all to fund David's financially unsound, speculative venture. The rage that had been simmering within me finally boiled over, a scalding wave washing away all doubt. I backed away silently, my mind reeling, a storm of fury and disbelief raging within me. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, an audacious display of favoritism. They would sacrifice Chloe's chance at life for David's speculative startup, using the very asset they refused to touch for a genuine, life-threatening emergency. The Lakeview property, once a cherished symbol of family unity, now felt like a pawn in their cruel game of selective affection, a game where Chloe and I were clearly, devastatingly losing. A new, ice-cold resolve hardened within me. If they wouldn't fight for Chloe, if they would sacrifice her for David's empty ambitions, then I would. And I would start by understanding every single detail about that property, every hidden clause, every buried secret that could unravel their self-serving scheme. The days that followed were a blur of frantic, desperate activity. Chloe was growing weaker with each passing hour, her prognosis darkening, her experimental treatments agonizingly delayed. My parents remained blissfully oblivious to my growing desperation, or perhaps simply chose to be. They continued their hushed, excited conversations about David's promising tech startup, their voices filled with a palpable anticipation that only amplified the agony of Chloe's suffering. The stark, unbearable contrast fueled my resolve, sharpening my focus. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I couldn't directly confront them. My last attempt had proven futile, dismissed with a wave of a hand and cold, unyielding words. I needed leverage, a silent weapon, a way to protect Chloe and expose their blatant favoritism without resorting to outright accusations they would simply deny, twisting the narrative to portray me as ungrateful or unreasonable. My focus narrowed with laser-like precision on the Lakeview property itself. If they were willing to use it as collateral for David's venture, there had to be a way to disrupt their plans, to force their hand, or at the very least, to secure a portion of its substantial value for Chloe. I spent countless, grueling hours poring over every single document related to the Lakeview house. The original purchase agreements, faded and brittle, the detailed land surveys, meticulously drawn, every single property tax record stretching back decades, even the archaic-looking deeds, handwritten and elegant, looping script dating back to the early 20th century. My background in scientific research, honed during my veterinary studies, though in a completely different field, had instilled in me a meticulous, almost obsessive approach to data. I cross-referenced dates, examined every obscure footnote, and painstakingly traced property lines on antiquated maps. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, the legal jargon often opaque and frustrating, but I was driven by a single, powerful, unyielding motivation. Chloe, her weakening cough, her fragile smile, her desperate hope, these fueled me through the long, lonely nights. I worked late, powered by copious amounts of strong coffee and a growing, incandescent sense of injustice. My small apartment transformed into a makeshift archive of paper and digital files, scattered across every available surface. The answers, I knew, had to be hidden somewhere within these reams of dry legal prose. I looked for anything unusual, any anomaly, any obscure detail, any forgotten clause that could be a potential snag, a bureaucratic hurdle for a major bank looking to underwrite a large commercial loan. My gaze swept over every page, every line, every faded stamp. It was in a dusty, brittle set of historical deeds, tied with fraying twine and tucked away in a forgotten box of old family photos in the attic, that I found it. An obscure, almost indecipherable clause, penned in that same elegant but faded script, referring to an environmental easement dating back to the early 20th century. It wasn't a standard, boilerplate easement for utilities or public pathways. This was different, its language hinting at something more profound. It vaguely mentioned protection of unique natural habitats and conservation of specific ecological features on the property, almost like an ancient promise to the land itself. My heart gave a sudden, cold flutter. This wasn't a flaw in the title, not a problem with ownership, but a significant restriction on use and development that predated most modern environmental laws. It was a legal vestige, a forgotten historical detail, easily overlooked by a casual property search or a standard appraisal, especially if the appraiser wasn't specifically looking for such historical anomalies. It seemed minor, almost irrelevant in the grand scheme of a multi-million-dollar loan, but my gut, my instincts honed by years of diagnosing subtle animal ailments, screamed otherwise. This felt like a hidden vulnerability, a tiny crack in their meticulously constructed plan. I immediately called a former classmate from college, Sarah, who had, against all odds, gone on to become a real estate attorney. I explained the situation to her cautiously, carefully, without revealing all the raw, agonizing family drama. I found this old easement, I told her, my voice barely containing my excitement, and I'm trying to understand its full implications for a potential loan, a very large one. Sarah, bless her patient, legal mind, was intrigued. After reviewing the scanned documents I sent her, she confirmed my suspicion, her voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. Emily, this is fascinating. It's an archaic type of conservation easement. It means that specific natural features on the property, even if they seem insignificant to the untrained eye now, are legally protected. Any significant development, or even major structural changes, might require additional permits, extensive, costly environmental impact studies, or even outright prohibition, depending on what they find on site. It could severely complicate a remortgage, especially for a commercial venture, because it fundamentally restricts the collateral's true market value and future development potential. Most banks wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole for a big commercial loan without a clear, exhaustive environmental assessment, given the risks. A wave of cold, electrifying relief, mixed with a chilling sense of vindication, washed over me. This was it. This was the leverage I needed. This wasn't about theft or fraud. It was about an obscure, overlooked legal detail that could quietly, subtly, and irrevocably unravel their self-serving plans. It was the perfect, indirect counterpunch, leveraging their own blindness and greed against them. Armed with Sarah's precise legal insights, a new resolve coursing through my veins, I drove to my parents' house the following afternoon, clutching the fated deed like a secret weapon. I found them in the kitchen, casually, almost giddily, discussing paint swatches for David's new startup office space, their voices light with anticipation. Chloe was upstairs, confined to her room, too weak, too fatigued, too ill to join them, her absence a stark, painful contrast to their frivolous preoccupation. I approached them cautiously, trying to keep my voice even, my expression neutral, betraying none of the turmoil raging within me. "Mom, Dad," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor of suppressed emotion, "I've been looking through the Lakeview property documents and I found something. An old environmental easement." I spread the brittle, yellowed page on the gleaming granite counter, pointing to the archaic script, my finger tracing the faded ink. It's quite old, but Sarah, my friend who's a real estate lawyer, says it could complicate things. She thinks it might affect David's remortgage, especially if the bank realizes it restricts future development on the land. My father, Arthur, barely glanced at the document. He scoffed, a familiar, dismissive sound that grated on my nerves, accompanying it with a grand, dismissive wave of his hand. "Emily, honestly, that's ancient history. Every single property has some obscure clause buried in its past. The bank already did their due diligence. David's hotshot lawyer looked everything over. It's nothing, just a historical quirk." My mother, Eleanor, nodded in agreement, her gaze still fixed on a vibrant blue fabric sample, her attention clearly elsewhere. "Your father's right, dear. You worry too much, darling. This is just David's good fortune, his big break. Don't spoil it with old papers and needless anxieties." They brushed me off with an almost practiced ease, their dismissive attitude a familiar, painful sting, a stark reminder of how little weight my words carried when they clashed with David's all-important interests. They were so utterly consumed by the glittering prospect of their son's grand venture, so blinded by the allure of his supposed success, that they were completely deaf to any potential roadblocks, even those I was laying out plainly before them, born of meticulous research and genuine concern. It was a calculated indifference, a clear, devastating statement that David's ambitions, however ill-conceived, unequivocally trumped any fleeting concern for Chloe's rapidly deteriorating health, or even a sensible, financially prudent assessment of their own colossal risks. But it specifically mentions unique natural habitats, I pressed, trying to inject a desperate urgency into my voice, a plea for them to truly listen. And Sarah said any major development on the property would require extensive environmental studies, complex permits, and could lead to significant delays, possibly even prohibiting certain types of construction. This could drastically devalue the collateral in the bank's eyes for a commercial loan, or at least cause significant delays. My father finally looked up, annoyance deeply etched on his face, his brow furrowed with thinly veiled irritation. Emily, for goodness sake, you're a vet, not a real estate expert, and certainly not a financial advisor. David's business is legitimate, innovative, and the bank is happy with the collateral. The terms are all but finalized. Stop trying to find problems where there aren't any. This is important for David's future, and frankly, your constant pessimism is becoming tiresome. The conversation ended with a curt, definitive dismissal, a clear, brutal message that my input was unwelcome and my concerns were utterly irrelevant. They were so utterly, irrevocably invested in David's success, so utterly blinded by their deeply ingrained favoritism, that they refused to even consider the possibility of a flaw in their grand plan, especially one brought to them by me. It solidified my resolve, chilling me to the bone. If they wouldn't listen to reason, if they wouldn't act to save Chloe, then I would have to act. Quietly, indirectly. The opportunity came subtly, almost innocently, a quiet whisper in the vast, interconnected world of professional networks. I knew David's business required swift approval from the bank, time was of the essence for his startup, and his massive loan was contingent on the Lakeview property's completely unencumbered status. I also knew that major banks, to protect their colossal investments, often relied on cautious, third-party environmental review firms for larger commercial loans, especially those involving older, potentially historically significant properties. Working through my own professional network, cautious contacts from environmental conservation groups I volunteered with on the side, and even a friend of a friend who worked in commercial real estate risk assessment, I managed to discreetly circulate information about a potentially interesting, obscure environmental easement on a certain lakeside property in northern Wisconsin. My anonymous tip was vague, devoid of any names or specific property details beyond a general geographic location and a historical time frame. I simply stated that a particular historical easement might impact future development potential and should be thoroughly reviewed by any lender considering large-scale commercial loans against such property. It was a tiny seed of doubt, meticulously planted in the vast, impersonal machinery of corporate bureaucracy, designed to take root and spread. I didn't directly contact David's bank. That would be too obvious, too easily traceable back to me, risking accusations of malice. Instead, I focused on the type of environmental consulting firms that major banks typically used for their due diligence on large commercial property loans. I crafted a seemingly innocent, general query on an online forum frequented by environmental policy enthusiasts and land use consultants, asking about the legal implications of obscure historical easements and whether they ever get flagged in modern, high-value loan assessments. I carefully crafted the post to sound like a genuine academic inquiry, a student's research question. The responses were varied, ranging from cynical dismissals to detailed legal explanations, but one, in particular, caught my attention. A former environmental consultant mentioned how such hidden clauses, if unearthed during a bank's rigorous due diligence process, could trigger an automatic, immediate flag for a deeper, more expensive, and far more time-consuming environmental impact study. That was my opening. I replied to that specific comment, feigning further academic interest, asking for a more specific example, and provided just enough geographic detail about the Lakeview area to pique their professional interest, hinting at the potential for a case study without giving away the exact property address. My actions were indirect, veiled, and entirely legal, a quiet ripple in a large, seemingly placid pond. I had done my part. Now the ripples would have to find their way to David's grand plans, and the karmic wheels, I hoped, would begin to turn, grinding slowly but surely. The tension in the air at my parents' house became palpable in the days that followed. It thickened with each passing hour, growing so heavy it felt as though it could be cut with a knife. David, usually bursting with an almost unbearable, over-the-top confidence, now looked increasingly harried, his perpetual swagger replaced by a nervous fidget. He was constantly on the phone, pacing the floor, his voice a low, agitated murmur, punctuated by frustrated sighs and muttered curses. My parents, who had been so eagerly certain about his startup's imminent, dazzling success, now wore worried frowns, deep lines etched between their brows. Their faces were drawn, their laughter absent. I kept a careful distance, observing them from the periphery, feigning an air of innocent ignorance. All the while, a cold knot of anxiety and anticipation tightened in my stomach. Had my subtle, anonymous intervention worked? Was the obscure, forgotten easement finally resurfacing to haunt their meticulously laid plans? I avoided asking direct questions, maintaining my detached facade, instead offering vague, sympathetic murmurs about business being tough or banks being notoriously slow these days. Then, the first concrete, undeniable sign appeared, a crack in their seemingly impenetrable wall of certainty. David slammed his phone down one evening, the abrupt sound echoing through the quiet house, his face flushed with a furious anger I hadn't seen in him since childhood. The bank's demanding another environmental assessment, he seethed, running a hand frantically through his already disheveled hair. They're saying some obscure, archaic easement clause has come up. It's going to delay everything by weeks, maybe even months. It's an absolute nightmare. My father, Arthur, looked equally furious, his face mirroring David's rage. What? That old thing Emily mentioned? That's utter nonsense. We told them it was insignificant, just a historical curiosity. My mother, Alina, wrung her hands, her usually composed demeanor replaced by a look of sheer panic. But David, what does this mean for your funding, your startup? We can't afford these delays. David paced the living room like a caged animal, his agitation mounting. It means they're putting everything on hold indefinitely until this environmental impact is fully assessed. They're talking about protected species, potential habitats, needing specialist consultants, lawyers. It's a bureaucratic black hole. I maintained my innocent facade, my voice carefully modulated to convey a neutral surprise. Oh, that old easement, I mused, feigning genuine shock. I did tell you it looked tricky. Sarah, my lawyer friend, said these things can be complex, especially with older properties. My parents shot me irritated, suspicious glances, but their anger was too consumed by the unfolding disaster to truly focus on me. They said nothing, their minds clearly racing, trying to comprehend the sudden, catastrophic shift in their plans. The irony was almost overwhelmingly bitter, a sharp, searing pang in my chest. They had dismissed my legitimate, desperate concerns about Chloe's life-threatening illness as not a real emergency, as a fad, as a personal medical issue not worthy of our shared family asset. Yet now, an obscure, forgotten clause in an old deed, unearthed by my quiet, indirect efforts, was deemed significant enough, financially risky enough, to completely halt a major multi-million-dollar financial transaction that was absolutely vital to their golden boy's dreams. The contrast was stark, brutal, the hypocrisy laid bare for all to see, even if they couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge my indirect role in its unveiling. The blind faith they placed in David and their utter disregard for Chloe was now costing them dearly. The delays spiraled out of control, a vortex of bureaucratic red tape and mounting costs. The environmental assessment, once initiated by the bank's cautious due diligence department, proved far more complicated and invasive than anyone, especially David, had anticipated. It wasn't just a simple paper review. It involved extensive on-site surveys, geological testing, ecological specialists crawling over the property, and a bureaucratic maze of permits and consultations that seemed designed specifically to frustrate and delay. David's initial investor, a high-strung, impatient venture capitalist, grew increasingly agitated. "Time is money, David," I overheard him say curtly during a tense, hushed phone call David took in the hallway, his voice barely a whisper. "If this collateral isn't clear, if these environmental liabilities aren't resolved immediately, we pull out. No more delays." The pressure mounted, crushing David, creating a palpable tension in the house that had once been so outwardly calm and secure. David became withdrawn, his once effervescent personality replaced by a sullen irritability, snapping at trivial things, consumed by his own spiraling anxieties. My parents, once so dismissive of Chloe's quiet suffering, now exhibited a panicked, almost frantic anxiety for David's failing venture, their faces mirroring his despair. The deafening silence from them regarding Chloe's desperate medical needs remained, a glaring, painful void against the backdrop of their newfound, self-inflicted financial desperation. Their chosen priorities were now exacting their heavy toll. The environmental firm, digging deeper, unearthed vague historical reports of a rare, federally protected beetle, thought to be extinct, possibly sighted near the Lakeview property decades ago. This, combined with the broadly worded natural habitat protection clause in the antique easement, escalated the review process to an unprecedented, almost ludicrous level. Every potential loan officer at the bank became hesitant, spooked by the escalating legal and environmental risks, envisioning endless litigation and public outcry. David's grand plans, once so certain, now hung by a precarious thread, caught in a seemingly impenetrable tangle of obscure regulations and unforeseen biological surveys. His dream venture, once so brightly envisioned, now shimmered distorted on the brink of collapse. My parents continued to fret, their anxieties mounting with each passing day, completely unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that their own dismissal of my initial, cautious warning had paved the way for this precise, agonizing outcome. They called their legions of lawyers, their bewildered bankers, their exasperated financial advisors, all of whom gave them the same infuriating, unhelpful news. The multi-million-dollar remortgage was indefinitely stalled until the environmental assessment was fully cleared, a process that, given the new complications, could potentially take months, possibly even years, if the beetle's sighting proved credible or further protected species were found. The sheer, suffocating frustration they experienced was a mirror image of the profound desperation Chloe and I had endured for weeks. But unlike Chloe's urgent, life-threatening medical need, David's predicament was entirely, karmically, of their own making. The scales were slowly, agonizingly beginning to balance. As David's financial plans continued their slow, agonizing unraveling, a subtle but deeply significant shift began to occur in my parents' demeanor. The initial, furious anger directed at the unforeseen complications eventually morphed into a quiet, profound desperation. Their phone calls became less about David's startup and his grand ambitions, and more about the mounting, exorbitant legal fees for the never-ending environmental assessment, the crushing weight of interest on a loan that wouldn't materialize, the terrifying potential loss of their significant investment in David's already failing business, and the sheer, debilitating frustration of being caught in an endless bureaucratic limbo. The Lakeview property, once their untouchable retirement goldmine, their secure vault of future pleasures, was now, ironically, a source of immense stress, a gaping financial black hole that threatened to swallow them whole. The glittering dream of David's lucrative tech empire, meticulously built on the collateral of our shared lake house, crumbled, inch by agonizing inch, into dust. Chloe, meanwhile, was growing demonstrably weaker, her bright spirit dimmed, her prognosis becoming increasingly grim with each passing day without the specialized experimental treatment. Her frail cough echoed in the quiet house, a constant, painful reminder of the urgency. My parents, seeing David's financial woes deepen into an abyss and faced with the stark, undeniable reality of Chloe's relentless deterioration, began to soften, their hard edges slowly eroding. My mother, Eleanor, once so dismissive, started calling me more frequently, her voice now laced with a genuine, raw worry about Chloe, a tremor of fear I hadn't heard before. "Emily, what can we do? We've tried everything for David, but this environmental issue, it's just endless. And Chloe, she looks so frail, so tired." My father, Arthur, usually so unyielding, so stubbornly resolute, even approached me one evening, his shoulders slumped, his face lined with exhaustion. Emily, he began, his voice surprisingly gentle, hesitant, almost fragile, about Chloe. Is there anything we can do now? This treatment you mentioned, is it still an option? Is there still hope? The shift was undeniable, palpable, a seismic tremor in the foundations of our family dynamics. But I remained cautious, my guard still up. This wasn't about simple, petty revenge. It was about getting Chloe the life-saving help she desperately needed. I didn't gloat, didn't hint, even subtly, at my meticulous involvement in planting the seed of the environmental snag. I simply laid out the unvarnished facts about Chloe's worsening condition, the terrifying speed of her decline, and the escalating, truly astronomical cost of her treatment, the figures stark and unforgiving. The treatment is still an option, Dad, I explained, my voice firm but devoid of bitterness. But time is running out rapidly, and the cost hasn't decreased. In fact, delays have only made it more expensive. Their silence this time was different, less dismissive, less superior, more burdened, more truly desperate. They finally saw the immeasurable value of Chloe's life clearly now, without the blinding, distorting distraction of David's hollow ambitions. The property, once seen by them as an unassailable asset, a golden calf for David's speculative gains, was now, in their minds, becoming Chloe's last potential lifeline, its value finally reconsidered under the crushing weight of their multiplying financial woes and her heartbreaking, relentless decline. The karmic balance was swinging slowly but inexorably. The true confrontation, the moment of reckoning, came when David's last, most crucial investor finally pulled out, publicly, irrevocably, citing unacceptable delays and unforeseen environmental liabilities linked directly to the Lakeview property. David was devastated, truly broken, his grand plans reduced to ashes, his once inflated ego deflated. My parents, facing the crushing, agonizing double blow of David's spectacular public failure and Chloe's rapidly declining health, were at their absolute wits' end, their resolve shattered. It was my mother, Eleanor, surprisingly, who finally broached the subject directly, her voice barely a whisper, thick with uncharacteristic defeat. "Emily," she said, her eyes pleading, "your father and I have been talking. The Lakeview property, we might need to consider selling it, or at least a significant portion to help Chloe. There seems to be no other way." My father, Arthur, though still visibly pained by David's public failure, his face etched with defeat, nodded slowly, reluctantly. It seems there's no other way now. Chloe's health is paramount. We were wrong." The words, though agonizingly belated, were a balm to my weary soul, a confirmation that the long, silent battle had not been in vain. The environmental snag had inadvertently and quite effectively stripped the property of its appeal as collateral for David's risky venture, forcing them, through sheer desperation, to finally see its true, most vital purpose: a resource for a genuine, life-and-death family emergency. I looked at them, my heart a tumultuous mix of profound relief and lingering, deep-seated hurt. "It's what should have happened months ago," I stated, my voice firm, though carefully devoid of any overt bitterness or triumph. "Chloe needed this then, she still needs it now. Every single day that passed was a day she suffered, a day she lost hope." The conversation that followed was difficult, raw, filled with unspoken apologies and tentative, hesitant steps towards a fragile reconciliation. They were finally willing to see past their decade-long favoritism, compelled by the undeniable force of David's crushing misfortune and Chloe's escalating, terrifying health crisis. The long-held illusion of David's flawless path, his golden future, was irrevocably broken, revealing the raw, ugly vulnerability beneath their biased choices. The Lakeview property, once a symbol of their misplaced priorities, was slowly but surely transforming into a reluctant testament to a bitter, hard-won lesson about true family values, a lesson carved out of suffering and desperation. The decision was made. The Lakeview property, or at least a significant portion of its value, would finally be used for Chloe's desperate, life-saving treatment. The complex process of selling a section of the land, or securing a specific, targeted loan against it, began immediately, spurred on by a newfound, frantic urgency from my parents. The environmental easement, once a subtle hindrance for David's grand but misguided remortgage, now became a curious, albeit manageable, point of negotiation for potential, patient buyers, requiring careful legal navigation, but no longer a catastrophic deal-breaker for a direct, necessary sale to help Chloe. My lawyer friend, Sarah, stepped in, a steady, calm presence to assist with the complex legalities, ensuring the process was transparent and, crucially, that Chloe's needs were prioritized above all else. The funds were secured with a surprising swiftness, a testament to the property's underlying, undeniable value once freed from the suffocating entanglement of David's complex, high-risk, ultimately doomed venture. It was a tangible victory, not just for Chloe, but for a decade of my own unwavering contributions and quiet sacrifices. The karmic balance had at long last shifted. Chloe began her arduous experimental treatment, a grueling regimen of medications and therapies. But slowly, painstakingly, we began to see small, precious improvements. Her energy, once completely sapped, returned in flickering bursts like a hesitant flame. Her eyes, once dull with fatigue, regained some of their vibrant sparkle, reflecting a renewed sense of hope. And her smile, once so rare and fragile, started to reappear more often, a radiant beacon in the long, dark tunnel. It was a long, challenging road, filled with setbacks and moments of despair, but it was finally, truly a road to recovery, a path we were all on together. My parents, witnessing Chloe's slow but steady progress, seemed genuinely relieved, and even, to my surprise, subtly remorseful. The experience had humbled them, forcing them to confront the devastating consequences of their blatant, years-long favoritism. They saw Chloe's vibrant spirit reemerging, a stark, beautiful contrast to the despair that had gripped her when they initially refused to help. The shift in their perspective was profound. Their focus was no longer solely on David's empty ambitions, but at long last on Chloe's fragile, precious health. As for David, his grand startup dream was dead, extinguished by the very collateral that was meant to fund it. The unforeseen environmental complications and the loss of his major investor had sent his meticulously crafted plans into a dizzying tailspin. He eventually, and rather reluctantly, took a job in a completely unrelated field, a mundane office position, a stark contrast to his earlier grandiose, self-inflated ambitions. Our relationship, once defined by his casual superiority, became strained, awkward, but with time, a tentative, cautious understanding began to form between us. He seemed, at last, to truly see the insidious consequences of his parents' favoritism, and perhaps his own debilitating over-reliance on their endless bailouts. The Lakeview property, once a symbol of his unchallenged privilege, now represented a harsh, indelible lesson in accountability. He learned for the first time to stand on his own 2 feet, forced to forge his own path without the convenient, ever-present safety net of his parents' unconditional financial support, a painful growth that, while difficult, was ultimately necessary for him. The Lakeview property itself was partially sold. A significant section of its beautiful, untouched lakefront transferred to a conservation trust to manage the unique natural habitats that had caused such unexpected chaos for David. The remaining portion, smaller but still cherished, remained in our family, a testament to resilience. It was no longer just a financial asset. It became a quiet monument to a difficult, deeply painful lesson learned, a constant, unspoken reminder that true family wealth lies not in material possessions or biased investments, but in unconditional love, unwavering support, and the courage to confront hard truths. My relationship with my parents was forever changed. We still loved each other, but the easy, unquestioning trust of my youth was replaced by a more mature, guarded respect. I had learned, through immense pain, to set firm boundaries, to advocate fiercely for what was right, and to recognize that true family love sometimes requires the courage to dismantle uncomfortable illusions and confront buried resentments. The bitterness lingered for a time, a shadow cast by their initial, devastating refusal, but it gradually receded as Chloe's health improved and our family, broken but resilient, began the slow, arduous process of healing. Have you ever experienced a similar situation, where you felt like you had to fight for what was right within your own family, even when it meant disrupting the peace and exposing uncomfortable truths? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story touched something in you, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that sometimes. The quietest actions can create the most profound shifts in family dynamics, forcing a necessary reevaluation of love and loyalty. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, true family support is revealed not in times of convenience, but in moments of genuine crisis, demanding that we stand firm for what truly matters, even if it means sacrificing familiar comfort.